Fred Turner est enseignant-chercheur à Stanford. Il fait toutes ses recherches sur l'histoire de l'art et les sciences de la communication. Il est au carrefour de ces trois éléments-là. Et il s'intéresse principalement à ce qui a été le développement des médias, mais de tous les types de médias depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Et puis tous les changements culturels qui ont accompagné les nouveaux événements médiatiques. Il a fait son doctorat en travaillant sur Stewart Brand et en ayant accès à ses papiers internes. Et de ce doctorat est né donc le livre en français Aux sources de l'utopie numérique, qui suit Stewart Brand autour de toutes ces incarnations et de ce que ça veut dire de l'espoir de la Silicon Valley, enfin l'espoir de ce qui s'est passé dans les années 60, mais en même temps les dérives qui s'en sont suivis, mais qui ont aussi quelque chose à voir avec le type d'espoir qu'il y avait dans les années 60. Avant de faire son doctorat, il était journaliste à Boston, et avant même cela, à 19 ans, il a travaillé avec Steve Jobs. Je lui ai demandé de vous raconter, mais juste si vous êtes sage à la fin de la conférence. En fait, il vit comme un anthropologue dans sa tribu, au milieu de la Silicon Valley. Et le fil rouge qui guide son travail, c'est comment, sous les mythes et les idéologies, retrouver les conditions concrètes de l'histoire des idées et des comportements. Et comment donc reconstruire ou construire une société démocratique. Alors je pense que ça va être le fil rouge de son intervention, une vingtaine de minutes. J'ai 2 questions en rebond que nous préparerions ensemble. Et puis après, ça sera à vous. Merci.
All right, so I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Hervé. Thank you, CNF Editions. Thank you, NEC, for bringing me here. I feel incredibly lucky to be in a world where democracy and technology are being discussed at the same time in a serious way. I live in Silicon Valley, and we have taken a turn to the right, which I know you have seen, and we need a little help. And as I walk around the building here, I see the people and the ideas that will bring us a little bit of help. And I appreciate that a lot. All right, so my job today is to try to answer the question, how did Silicon Valley hijack the internet? I'll talk for just 15 minutes or so, show some pictures, and then we will have a lot of time for questions and answers. Right now, I will tell you the answer to the question. Silicon Valley hijacked the internet not only by building certain technologies, but by linking those technologies to certain stories. The internet was hijacked not by machine makers, but by marketers. And I'll talk about how that happened. I'll tell the story in 3 parts. In the first part, I will return us to the dream of a utopian internet, an internet of interconnections, of deep interpersonal intimacy, an internet before trolls. Oh, well, all right. Then I'll take us to the early 2000s and to the sudden realization that the internet of our fantasy depended entirely on technologies and business practices that were anything but utopian. Finally, I'll point to some of the new work I'm doing. You know, I would argue that we have left behind the era of networking that was the 1990s, and we have entered a new era with digital technology, an era of extraction. We have entered the era of mining and gas exploration for digital technologies. And we are embracing, in Silicon Valley, authoritarian political forces that we believe can help us do the extracting work. All right, so that's where we're headed. All right, but let's start when things were happy. So here we are in California in the 1960s. On the right, in 1969, you see perhaps the first node on the internet. That's a very, very, very early server at UC Los Angeles. And on the left, you see a poet, Richard Brautigan. In 1967, Richard Brautigan lived in Haight-Ashbury, and he wandered the streets passing out this poem, all watched over by machines of loving grace. And some of you, only very few, I see, are old enough to know this poem. But for those who are not, I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like water touching clear sky. I like to think right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. As I think you can see, there's a vision here that is simultaneously technocratic and countercultural. When the internet emerges, it emerges in a California that is deeply invested in the utopian vision of society. Between 1966 and 1973, we saw the largest wave of commune building in American history. As many as 750,000 Americans moved out of their houses, went back to the land, back to the communes, and built what they hoped would be a different kind of society. If mainstream society was built around politics, bureaucracy, institutions, commune society could be built around consciousness. We could leave politics behind, and we could simply program each other with our messages. I could send you my signals, you could send me your signals, we could dance in ways that mirrored one another, and we would achieve an intimacy that did not require government. Now, one of the reasons I wrote the counterculture book was because I had written a book about the Vietnam War, and I wanted something more cheerful. And so I thought, I'd spent 3 years with combat veterans, and I was tired of war. And I thought the communes would be happy places. Not so much. The communes, when I started studying them, were mirrors of the suburban world that the young people who founded the communes left behind. They were worlds where when you take rules away, you get charismatic male leaders dominating the situation. Women find themselves in the position of serving the men. People of color are not welcome, and homosexuals are not welcome. Now, there are exceptions to this in some of the communes, but they were tremendously conservative. And that's important because the dream of the world of interconnected cyberspace is one that is seemingly open in theory, but also quite prejudicial in fact. And that combination is a strange one. So by 1996, the countercultural dream of the internet had become the dominant view, at least in California, among California marketers and pundits. This is John Perry Barlow. He's a Republican. He's dead now, but a Republican who was also the lyricist for the counterculture band The Grateful Dead. And he wrote in 1996 something called a Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Many of you will know this. The key ideas in that declaration were that cyberspace existed outside ordinary space. It was beyond government. It didn't require bodies. To be a citizen of cyberspace, all you had to have was consciousness and voice. In that sense, Barlow's cyberspace grew out of the communal dream of a society that didn't have to do politics anymore. A society in which consciousness and intimacy, personal expressiveness and closeness, could replace the work of the state, the work of bureaucracy, the work of institutions. Apple marketed this idea very powerfully. So did Google. So did Wired magazine. So did our government officials at the time. The idea that we were building a networked universe, a layer of interconnected consciousness above and outside all the difficulties of class-ridden, racism-ridden, sexism-ridden society was the dream. And it was a dream that very explicitly and carefully ignored certain facts. One of those facts was technological. To build a global network, you have to build a global network of machines that eat energy, that drink water, to stay cool, that are material resources. The internet does not live in cyberspace, it lives in servers. The other thing that the original theorists of the internet, the utopian internet, forgot carefully was the power of commerce. Steve Jobs, for example, and we will tell the Steve Jobs story at the end of the hour. I have feelings about Steve Jobs. He doesn't have feelings about me anymore, but he did for a bit. In any case, Apple and other firms like it said, look, we're not building machines to sell them. We're building machines to change the world. And that idea has gone everywhere. Mark Zuckerberg has parroted it in selling Facebook. But as you know, Facebook is a data acquisition and remarketing platform. As you participate, it monitors you, it takes your behaviors, and it resells them to others. The point here is that cyberspace never left this world behind. It depended on material things, it depended on commerce. And today, we are entering a new era of extraction. Artificial intelligence is an extension of search, and it's an extension of the surveillance practices that define social media. A lot of people will tell you that artificial intelligence is a very new thing. I disagree intensely. Artificial intelligence, to me, is an extension of search. It's an extension of existing technologies, and large language model technologies are not new. They go back to the 40s and 50s. What is new here is the scale. So this is an OpenAI center under construction in Abilene, Texas. It's one of dozens of similar structures under construction around the United States. These structures eat tremendous amount of electricity. In Texas, the New York Times estimates that average electricity bills have increased 5% across the entire state, a huge state, because of the arrival of AI server centers. Okay. Pause for a moment of self-advertisement. There's an article called The Texan Ideology, which I wrote about this, and that will be coming out tomorrow online on the Baffler, and it's available in print in French today. All right. This new era of extraction requires a radically deregulated environment. It requires a radically deregulated natural environment. You need to have access to land, water, electricity. California doesn't offer those very easily anymore, but Texas sure does. And if you align yourself, as tech leaders have, with authoritarians in power in Washington and in Texas, if you occasionally say, as Elon Musk does, that Jesus was a good person, if you occasionally mouth some of the Christian nationalist rhetoric that the right espouses, you can build server centers in a state that leaves you alone and lets you make your money, but that, of course, also lets you take their resources. All right, so that's kind of a depressing fact. It's sort of where we are. Hervé instructed me carefully to make sure that I left you on a higher note. So I'm famous in my little world at home, especially at Stanford where I teach. My students are like, yeah, Turner, he's smart, but he's such a downer. You know, because my lectures famously end with critique. And so let me try not to be a downer today. Okay. The first thing I want to say is we should not head back to the electronic frontier. There is a dream that is still alive on the left in America, and hopefully less so here, that left politics depends primarily on voice and identity, that you need to present yourself, your voice, speak up, and only in that way, when voices can be heard, will politics change. That's in some ways the dream that animated the electronic frontier, the idea that there's a space of speech, and if we simply get the space of speech right, everything else will follow. I think we've learned that that doesn't work. We still need to get the space of speech right, but we absolutely have to connect it to institutions. And this is why I'm so excited to be here. When I saw the list of participants and sponsors at the NEC, It was a list that could not exist in the United States. It was a list of civic actors that would not gather in this way in most of the places that I go. It's a list of civic actors that people in Silicon Valley are actively at this point trying to get rid of, trying to push away. All right, so how do we fight that? Well, in Silicon Valley, we are fighting it. There's Tech Workers Coalition is a union for tech workers that's been quite active in the streets. There are a lot of ways that you can resist authoritarian actions inside a company as an engineer, though we tend not to talk about them. There are modes of passive resistance that are very powerful, and we see those now inside Google and inside Palantir. And above all, we can remember that the state works for us. You know, the tech world has told us a story that the internet and our machines can do the work of the state better than the state. We don't need the state if we just get consciousness shared. If we just share our speech with one another, the state will melt away. The idea of a state melting away is a corporate CEO's dream. If the state melts away, there's nothing but the world as an open market, a free market, a frontier for profit. And that's not where I want to live. Thank you. Sorry.
Merci Fred Turner. Pour compléter ce qu'il vient de dire, voilà le cadeau qu'il nous a. L'idée d'une masterclass, c'est quand même d'essayer de creuser encore plus loin. Et moi, je voudrais creuser dans le temps et dans l'idée, dans les idées, en remontant jusqu'à l'idée de la cybernétique. La cybernétique, l'air de rien, ça a été un grand mouvement d'idées au cours à la fin du XXe siècle. Et ce mouvement d'idées, il est parti d'une définition de la société, ce qu'a fait Wiener, mais aussi qui s'est servi les ingénieurs de cette société, ce qu'a aussi fait Wiener. Et l'idée de Wiener, c'est que le monde entier est un monde d'information. L'information se réunit, circule, et il y a une boucle de rétroaction qui obtient l'équilibre. Or, cette idée a été complètement intégrée à l'intérieur des ordinateurs, mais la question qui se pose, c'est de savoir, est-ce que celle-ci permet réellement des relations sociales avec des individus aussi fantasques que sont les êtres humains? Vous savez, cette machine imprévisible dont parle le poète Jean Vasca. Les êtres humains, je pense qu'ils ont besoin de structures, d'intermédiaires, que ce soit des partis, des syndicats, des religions, des groupes formels ou informels, de manière à s'auto-convaincre et s'auto-représenter. Et ça n'est pas inscrit dans la grande idéologie qui est celle de la cybernétique. Et la cybernétique n'a pu avoir autant d'influence sur les ordinateurs qu'à partir du moment où l'ordinateur était personnel et la personne qui utilisait cet ordinateur personnel était une seule personne dans laquelle on pouvait faire des calculs, extraire des calculs pour représenter la société comme une seule personne. Alors Fred, je pense que tu peux élaborer là-dessus parce que déjà tu l'as fait dans cet excellent livre.
Thank you, Hervé. Merci, Hervé. I feel like a representative at the United Nations. During World War II, Americans were confused. Germany, which we thought was the most sophisticated, pardon the French, but most sophisticated country in Europe at the time, in the 1940s. They brought us Beethoven, they brought us Goethe. They had been taken over by this ridiculous clerk, Adolf Hitler. How had that happened? Well, many Americans believe that it had happened because of mass media, one-to-many media. Hitler had taken over the radio, had taken over the cinema, had taken over the newspapers. And if one-to-many media produced fascism, then Americans had to make a kind of media that would produce democracy. And that work became entangled with the invention of electronic computers at MIT in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. So Norbert Wiener, an MIT scientist at the time, led a team at the Macy conferences that reimagined the world as a leveled information system. A leveled information system in which every individual citizen could present their information and receive feedback from another system, another person. In Wiener's vision, all you needed to do was recognize that the world was information, deploy information technologies in networks, and let people talk to each other. Out of that, a democratic order would emerge. Now, Wiener didn't actually live that way. He actually was kind of a dominant hierarchical guy. But that vision became the foundation of the countercultural vision of utopia, the idea of just interconnected networks. And it haunts some parts of networked computing today. The challenge, I think, is to recognize that that vision, as dominant as it was ineffective for producing equality. That, on the contrary, when you take intermediary institutions away, what you get is what you see in communes. You get what I call rule by cool. You get charismatic leaders. Charismatic leaders that might be on the right as much as the left. Charismatic leaders that carry with them the cultural cachet that we associate to gender norms, i.e., they are usually men. In the United States, they carry the cachet that we organize around race and racism. They're mostly white. So cultural norms, including stereotypes and many of the worst parts of culture, emerge and rise and gain power in the hyper-individuated world that Norbert Wiener predicted or wanted. And that's what I think of as the deepest irony of our moment, that many of the authoritarian trends that we're seeing now are rooted in a very sincere effort to produce democratic technology and democratic communication in the middle of the 20th century.
Le deuxième mot sur lequel je voudrais que Fred puisse élaborer un peu, c'est le terme extractivisme. Vous connaissez, vous savez que les humains extraient des choses de la nature, donc c'est l'extraction, mais que depuis une bonne vingtaine d'années, on a franchi un stade supérieur qui est l'extractivisme, c'est-à-dire au lieu d'aller creuser une mine, on va raser la montagne pour récupérer les minerais à l'intérieur. Nous vivons aujourd'hui une époque d'extractivisme numérique. Au début, il y a eu de l'extraction numérique, c'est-à-dire des gens comme Facebook pouvaient récupérer des données, tracer un graphe social. Il y avait une origine des données. Mais très très vite, on s'est aperçu qu'on pouvait avoir des data brokers qui, eux, récupéraient toute une série de données, de big data, et ces data brokers pouvaient ensuite s'en servir pour retourner le pouvoir des données contre les utilisateurs qui avaient donné leurs données. Ensuite, on s'est aperçu qu'on pouvait avoir des outils qui allaient encore plus loin avec les données quand on les avait en masse, c'est-à-dire quand on avait détruit toute la montagne et que même les déchets pouvaient servir à être de l'information qui allait nourrir nos intelligences artificielles. On voit très très bien aujourd'hui de quels déchets je parle qui nourrissent les intelligences artificielles, notamment quand ils sont manipulés par des puissances antidémocratiques. Donc on a besoin de toujours plus de données qui n'ont plus besoin d'être segmentées, donc d'être réorganisées, d'être pensées, par exemple par des bibliothécaires, par des universitaires, par des sociologues, etc. Et on est passé d'un mode d'extraction de données à un mode d'extractivisme. Et quel va donc être dans cette situation le rôle des pouvoirs, à la fois les pouvoirs pour, comme il l'a dit dans son exposé, aider ces extractivistes à continuer leur modèle de développement infini à partir des données produites par tout un chacun, et encore une fois tout un chacun isolé et non pas des données produites par des groupes qui ont des systèmes de réflexion, qui produisent, qui avancent, etc. Et quel va être aussi le rôle des pouvoirs publics pour la protection de la vie privée, parce que les données qu'on va avoir sont et seront à l'avenir de plus en plus privées. Aujourd'hui, nous pensons aux données que quelque part volontairement nous produisons en utilisant les outils d'Internet, mais songez à ce qui est en train de se passer avec les données cérébrales. Comment, aujourd'hui, alors qu'on a de plus en plus d'outils pour lire directement des données cérébrales, c'est très bien, par exemple, pour les gens handicapés qui n'ont plus de moyens de s'exprimer autre que de penser, de pouvoir cliquer sur un bouton par la pensée. Le problème, c'est qu'à partir du moment où vous allez avoir des outils qui servent positivement dans ce cas-là, ils vont se développer partout. La Chine a prévu d'être en 2027 la nation en tête de l'extraction de données cérébrales. Alors, quel va être le rôle des pouvoirs publics aujourd'hui? C'est la question que je pose à Fred, c'est la question à 1000 euros, hein, bien sûr.
Well, my brain is still unextracted, which is thank you, Hervé. So, good news and bad news. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that digital media have rendered whole parts of our lives available to mining, repurposing, profit making that were not available before. My favorite example of this, and I teach this in my undergraduate class to 19-year-olds, is dating apps. Okay, let's just take a moment. I don't know if this is true in France. How many of you have used a dating app? You are so shy. I don't believe that. I do not believe that only 5 people here have used a dating app. But maybe. In America, if I ask that question, every hand goes up. Okay? Every hand that hasn't been married for 20 or 30 years. And what's interesting about dating apps is that in order to use them, you have to create a profile, present information, and turn yourself into a product. And then that data is reused in lots of other ways, which we know. What's happening there is an extraction of the social relationship of courting and its re-engagement in the commercial process of product development. The transformation of courting, one of the most intimate, important things that people do, and maybe they still do it in person in France, into a product is an astonishing human development. Now, I teach a class every year on the rise of digital culture, and for every year I've asked my students how they speak to someone who they might want to have a relationship with. 20 years ago, the answer was, oh, I call them on the phone or I meet them for coffee. Maybe 3% said anything else. Now, 95% say text, 3% say social media and Instagram, 2% say, I don't meet anybody. It's astonishing. And this is at a university where they have thousands of people like themselves to choose from. Okay, that's a minor case of the extraction problem that we're facing. All right, but here's the good news. The good news is that as societies, we have faced extractive, polluting technologies before, and we have, within limits, overcome them. When I look at our moment, I think of the 1920s in America. I think of a time when the oil industry was a series of conglomerated firms, all integrated, polluting the land, building oil, tearing down public transportation and putting up cars. And yes, we still have highways in the US, and yes, that's a problem, but we were able to regulate those industries, we were able to reduce the pollution, we were able to make the world a better place. We have faced extraction before. The good news is that the kinds of extraction we're seeing are actually very familiar. The building of large extraction plants in Texas, to an American, looks a lot like building an oil field. And Texas has regulated oil fields for generations. So my point here is that, yes, extraction is underway. Yes, it conduces to authoritarian states that permit it, celebrate it, profit from it corruptly. But we, as citizens in democracies, have experience confronting extractive industries, and we can confront this one too.
Merci Fred. J'aurai encore des tas de questions parce que j'ai lu tous ces bouquins. Mais c'est à vous maintenant.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Tout d'abord, bravo pour votre travail. Je pense que c'est grâce à des gens comme vous qu'on arrive à voir ce qui se passe dans la Silicon Valley, et c'est quand même très très compliqué pour nous, et donc on vous soutient, c'est déjà le premier point. Je voulais avoir votre opinion sur ce qu'on appelle le web 3.0, qui est finalement le web décentralisé. Est-ce que ça serait une bonne forme? Alors, je voulais avoir votre avis, parce qu'à la fois, il y a un côté intéressant de se réapproprier et de sortir du web 2.0, mais avec des conséquences, puisque c'est basé quand même sur la blockchain, etc., avec des conséquences écologiques qui peuvent être désastreuses et qui peuvent être réutilisées par des acteurs qui finalement se servent à nouveau, il y a des projets Facebook, etc., Meta, pardon, pour récupérer ça. Donc je voulais votre opinion. Est-ce que c'est une façon, finalement, il faut se réapproprier en sortant carrément du modèle, tel qu'on le connaît, Web 2.0, voilà, ou est-ce que finalement c'est un vœu pieux, enfin, voilà, c'est voué à l'échec. Voilà. Merci beaucoup.
It's a great question. It's a really important question. There are two pieces there. I want to separate them. One is distributed computing in Web 3.0, and the other would be blockchain technologies and cryptocurrency. Let me take them separately. So I think distributed computing and the geographic and political distribution of computing centers and computing systems could be a very good thing. It provides variety where there isn't variety. You know, for instance, there are American systems that can penetrate the Chinese internet in ways that China doesn't love, but because we have servers in Virginia, we're able to do things from there that we couldn't do otherwise. So I'm in favor of that. I want to say a little bit more about that in a moment. Cryptocurrency, you know, I think cryptocurrency is a curse. I think cryptocurrency is a fantastic technique for enabling those who can access the currency, who tend to be elite, very mobile, very wealthy, to live very elite, very mobile lives in a kind of cyberspace above the rest of us. And so if cryptocurrency is tremendously energy inefficient. You know, it costs me so much less money to print a euro than it does to make a blockchain piece. So I'm not a fan of cryptocurrency. In a weird way, I see cryptocurrency as the bastard child of the electronic frontier dream. You know, that we can build a system that is above and outside politics and better than politics because it's governed by machines, when in fact what we're building is a system that's bigger than politics, outside politics, and governed by technologists. So that scares me a lot. In both cases, Web 3.0 and blockchain, I think the key issue is where we locate these technologies institutionally. I think that if we think about them only as devices and only as technical systems, we'll miss the thing that we have to do, which is ask, how are these systems articulated with state organizations, non-state actors? So distribute computing geographically, great. How do we distribute computing institutionally? One of the things that I saw on the program here that I was especially excited about was people thinking about ways to integrate computing into the mission of public-facing institutions. So these are hospitals, social service organizations. That's a great way to work. Whether it can push back on the Chinas or the Americas as they try to centralize control of these global systems, I don't know, but that's where I'd like to see the energy go.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. Je me posais la question parce qu'on voit de plus en plus la Chine s'affirmer comme un géant de la tech avec également voilà, de grandes entreprises partiellement contrôlées par l'État, avec l'État qui est même capable d'enlever quelqu'un comme Jack Ma, par exemple, de la présidence d'Alibaba temporairement pour montrer qu'elle assoit bien sa puissance sur ces grands conglomérats technologiques. Et je me posais la question, comment est-ce que en fait, les valeurs chinoises issues du confucianisme, qui peuvent être peut-être un peu différentes, très certainement même, de celles dans lesquelles voilà, les États-Unis ont grandi, comment est-ce qu'elles s'approprient finalement ce que vous mentionnez, c'est-à-dire cette idéologie de la Silicon Valley, comment est-ce qu'elle la transforme et en quoi est-ce que ça rebat peut-être les cartes d'un futur technologique qui sera certainement davantage chinois qu'américain, dans la mesure où les Chinois contrôlent aujourd'hui 90% de l'extraction de terres rares, 70% de leur transformation et commencent à imposer maintenant des lois d'extraterritorialité, c'est-à-dire des licences sur les produits qui utilisent plus de 0,1% de matériaux rares. Donc voilà, je pense au Walkman par exemple. Non, je pense aux chips et autres. Voilà, merci.
Great, thank you. The Chinese case is a really tricky one. I'm very lucky. In my department, I have, I think, the best researcher on the Chinese internet working today, a woman named Jennifer Pan, whose work is incredible. So I would dispute your account of China just a little bit. I don't think Confucian values are what's driving the Chinese net or are going to shape dramatically how China adopts American ideas if they do. You know, I think there are multiple Chinas. There's Beijing, but there's Taiwan. and Taipei is the great producer of chips. And even within China, mainland China, there's Shenzhen. And Shenzhen is extraordinarily innovative. I've seen, I haven't been there in 20 years, but I've seen photographs of hacker spaces decorated with pictures of Steve Jobs. We will come back to him. So I think that within China, there's actually an extraordinarily innovative technological class. But I think they're working within an authoritarian state that has real material military power over their lives. And its primary mission is to preserve itself and its power. And so the challenge in the Chinese system is not to ascribe their long-term influence to either their technology or to their values, but rather to recognize that the way they do the internet is shaped by their authoritarian political regime. And it could be otherwise. And it is otherwise in Taiwan, and that's part of why we're there. That poses a challenge then for the US. As the US moves toward a more authoritarian state form, will we begin enforcing norms on online discussion in the ways that the Chinese do? We're already seeing Trump start to expel visiting British journalists who speak out against Palestine. We're seeing free speech rights corrode. We're seeing troops enter the cities in a way that they never have. And these are the first signs that we're taking the authoritarian turn. So my concern is less with internet systems or cultures than with authoritarian state forms and the way that they will deploy the internet. Even if the authoritarians win, though, everywhere, I still think your point earlier about the distributed internet is well taken. And I think there are ways to fight the good fight even from within those countries. That's certainly going on in China now. It's going on in the States. And I'm really hoping France will be an active player.
Merci pour votre conférence. C'était très intéressant. Moi, j'ai une question. Vu que vous êtes un expert de la cybernétique, est-ce que vous connaissez l'exemple chilien CyberSyn et qui est, je vous laisse expliquer peut-être, mais qui est une tentative, enfin c'est un expert londonien qui est venu aider le gouvernement d'Allende pour utiliser les technologies de l'information pour faire de la planification socialiste de l'économie et justement dans un but de démocratie et d'égalité, qui a été saboté d'ailleurs par des concitoyens à vous, la CIA. Et du coup, je voulais savoir si, dans une certaine mesure, à l'époque, c'était fait avec des telex, donc de technologies de l'information très très primitives, dans une région du monde mal desservie en hardware. Aujourd'hui, la technologie est un peu mieux distribuée. Et je me demandais ce que vous pensiez de l'utopie allendienne effectivement, de distribuer de la capacité de calcul auprès des institutions. Est-ce que c'est une chose souhaitable ou est-ce que ça nous emmènera potentiellement à un état-surveillance inévitablement?
Thank you. So CyberSign was a project of the Chilean socialist state undertaken in the early 70s with advice from Stafford Beer, who was a British cyberneticist, as well as other British officials. And it proposed, I would argue, not to democratize society, though that's what they said they were going to do. On the contrary, what it proposed to do was centralize the acquisition of information about society so as to accelerate decisions that could be made by the government. How many of you have seen the television show Star Trek? Okay, so interesting. You're willing to admit to that, but not the dating apps. Okay, that's interesting. All right, so the first Star Trek you remember had the command center, right, the deck where the captain sits. The CyberSign central headquarters was designed to look like the Star Trek deck. Seriously. So there were command chairs that looked just like Captain Kirk's chair. And around the walls were screens that were meant to feed data in from different parts of the society as it emerged. Economic data, social data, labor data. And then the commanders in the chairs were ostensibly going to be able to make decisions. Now, I found it fascinating that CyberSign was promoted at the time as a democratizing technology. To me, prima facie, it looked like a centralizing technology. So on the one hand, yes, the CIA took Allende down, and that was a terrible thing and one of a number of crimes my country has committed in South America and around the world. But the vision of socialist democracy that Allende had on offer in Cybersign looked a lot more like the vision of democracy that the German Democratic Republic offered to me. It did not look like a liberating vision. And there's a wonderful book on this by Eden Medina, which I recommend anyone read. So I don't view that as a liberating view. And the centralization of data, I think, is generally a threat to democracy. You see now Elon Musk and the Doge actors working to centralize multiple discrete databases within the United States. Palantir has a contract to do this for the Trump administration. If you integrate databases across government, you give a dictator the power to do push-button oppression. And so I don't believe that Allendean computing is a way forward. On the contrary, I think it's the opposite of what we might want to do. Great.
We understand better where we're coming from. We understand better where we are now.
Great.
And I just wanted to know if you have an opinion on where we are going and if there's a gap with your own belief, with your own dream.
Sure. Thank you for asking that. This is usually the point in a talk where I say, I'm a historian. I don't know the future. But I'm not going to say that. I think we're headed, at the moment, we're on a fast train, at the very least, to a more feudal global order, an order where different regions have feudal lords in charge of them. My own belief is that in the United States, we are entering an era of fascism. And I mean that straight up. I can walk through a definition of fascism, and I believe the Trump administration meets that definition. And we're in an era in the United States where large technology firms that claimed to be assisting and designed for the liberation of citizens for democratic purposes, like Palantir, believe it or not, or Apple, or Amazon, are explicitly helping an authoritarian regime take and use power. I think we're headed to a world where the incentives are going to line up for that process to continue. I think the challenge for those of us who don't want that world to come into being is to articulate a better one. And again, in the States right now, most of us on the left are lying on our backs crying. It's a sort of horrible picture. The Democratic Party is extraordinarily weak. Many of my colleagues at the university it's something I've never seen before. They're afraid. They're keeping their heads down. They're not talking. I'm very open. I'm very explicit. They see me coming down the hall. It's like, oh, here he comes. And that, that's pretty frustrating. I do think that the authoritarian turn can be resisted. But to resist it, we need to re-invoke the mission of the institutions that we treasure. We need to re-invoke the service in the United States. We need to re-invoke the ways that, for example, the medical institutions serve all Americans. We need to re-invoke the notion of all Americans. We serve all Americans. Our technological systems serve everyone. We don't just serve elites. We don't just serve mafia bosses. We serve everyone. And here again, I don't mean to idealize France, but I want to, I'll maybe speak a little out of turn. I was at a big AI conference at my university about a year ago, and a leading AI researcher who will go unnamed for a reason that will become clear in a moment, together with a very famous former political leader who will also go unnamed, said, France, they regulate. And then the political leader says, we innovate. I was chilled to the bone. Because I think that what we need to be doing is innovating in the social space exactly the way that France is doing it. I think we need to innovate at the intersection of technologies and institutions, and we need to make the case loudly and frequently that we serve everyone. We believe in everyone. We want to give everyone a chance. We want a society where everybody gets a shot. And we want to do that in a way where we can negotiate across our differences coherently, clearly, effectively. And to negotiate across differences, this is what the communes taught me, you have to have institutions. You can't negotiate with just people sitting in a room sharing consciousness. It doesn't work. It leads to the kind of thing we see online all day long. You need institutions, you need reason, you need rules, and you need to defend those things and their value against people like Donald Trump who want to tear them all down for personal gain. Thanks. Thank you. Well, thanks.
Juste un mot.
He's always
Fred
looking
a parlé.
left, you know? That's a joke.
Fred a parlé du recensement aux États-Unis, qui est un élément absolument énorme du pouvoir des données sur la construction de la politique, notamment parce que c'est ce qui permet l'élaboration des countries, des endroits où sont élus les gens. Et vous suivez certainement qu'aux États-Unis aujourd'hui, il y a un grand débat où les républicains essayent de construire des endroits où ils sont sûrs de gagner, et ça s'appelle le gerrymandering aux États-Unis, et c'est assez terrible. Eh bien, Dana Boyd vient de finir un livre qui paraîtra dans un an sur les fonctionnaires, mais elle utilise le terme public servant et pas seulement fonctionnaire au sens bureaucratique. Et ça me semble un élément très important de cette résistance qui continue d'exister à l'intérieur des institutions.
Merci beaucoup, c'est une bonne transition avec ma question. Déjà, merci pour votre présence ici. Parmi nous, on est plusieurs, voire assez nombreux, justement, à être agents publics, public servants. Et je pense qu'avec toute la pluralité de nos opinions politiques, on est quand même très attachés dans le numérique public à conserver, ou protéger plutôt, une vision ouverte, distribuée, pluraliste, diverse de la manière dont le numérique nous permet d'opérer le service public. Et la France est aussi, on va dire, un des modèles de service public égalitaire, continu et mutable, mutability. Et du coup, vous avez offert un t-shirt Résiste. Moi, en tant qu'agent public, parfois j'ai un peu peur de ce qui va peut-être nous arriver ou de ce qui nous arrive déjà. Et donc, quels sont vos conseils, recommandations pour résister ou en tout cas continuer à être alignés avec nos valeurs dans des environnements très incertains, là où aussi on a besoin que nos responsables publics peut-être soient un petit peu moins dans le fantasme et un peu plus dans la réalité, soit moins dans l'admiration de la technologie, mais plutôt dans la rétro-ingénierie des techniques. Comment on fait pour avoir une posture qui nous permette de nous sentir en sécurité et de prendre soin de finalement notre mission de service public?
Great. So first, I just want to celebrate public service. It's a high calling, and it is under attack across my country, and it makes me ashamed. I think public service is one of the highest callings that we have, and I can't tell you how strange it is for me to be among a group of public servants and how happy-making. Most of my time, most of my social life is among Silicon Valley tech guys. And it's fine, I survive, but it's not this. All right, so how do we preserve public service in this case? There are several techniques, and I'll name the ones that I know about. I don't know how this would work in France, but in the States, it's very important that we take to the streets and show ourselves to one another in person in our bodies. There's a lot of online shouting that has relatively little effect. It tends to get people more exercised and more lonely. We need to build solidarity, and solidarity is only built through collaborative action in person. There's a wonderful book on the table outside by Zeynep Tufekci about the failure of Tahrir Square and the Spring. And the argument in the book, Hervé, what's the title of that book? Zeynep's book?
Twitter et les gaz lacrymogènes.
Ah, very good. Okay, thanks. Yeah, Twitter and tear gas is the English. Yeah, great. So Twitter and tear gas. The point she makes is that you can't organize a resistance online. You have to do it in person, and it takes time. So the first thing to do is find your people, do things together in person, and do them visibly when it's appropriate to do them visibly. And you see that here with the Tech Workers Demanding Justice. Tech Workers Coalition has been very active behind the scenes in Silicon Valley, but at different times they've come out and said, here we are. And suddenly, if you're sitting at your desk wondering, am I the only one who thinks this way? You find others who don't, and that reduces fear. So reducing fear is really, really important. You reduce fear by creating solidarity. Once you reduce fear, you can begin to take action. And you can take action individually or together, You can organize groups inside your company. So for example, in Google, a series of employees objected to Google's being deployed to create military technology called Maven. And they were able to shut the program down. That's very impressive. Now, Google still has some military contracts, but one step at a time. So you can take steps inside the firm if you're organized, if you have solidarity, if you know your purpose, and if you take the values that Silicon Valley has been selling us for so long and point out that we are not serving those values in these companies. Google says, you're a company that doesn't want to be evil, and yet we build devices that kill people. Okay, that's a thing. Then the state. The state's another challenge because, of course, we're not the only people struggling for the state. Jeff Bezos wants the state. Elon Musk wants the state. So we have to stake our claim on that. And again, the process, I think, is similar. Build solidarity, organize, and then apply pressure where you can to get representatives who stand for you. I think it's the only way. The good news is that here in France, you have an infrastructure that is being taken apart in the United States. And this is something that I think I would stress. If it comes to you, if what's happening to us comes to you, one of the first things you'll see is a deliberate effort to tear down public service in all its functions, in the government, but also in the university system. You know, one of my colleagues, I'm a department chair, one of my faculty members has his email subpoenaed by Congress. His whole private life is in Washington right now. It's terrible. So you'll see that attack. Build resistance now, build solidarity now, build the democracy that you want to see now, and if the attack comes, you'll be ready.
Yes, sir.
Je voudrais rebondir sur cette question. Nous avons vu avec la grève des scénaristes de Hollywood la première grève contre l'intelligence artificielle. Je pense qu'il y en aura d'autres contre cet extractivisme qui construit un système qui va par ailleurs détruire ensuite les emplois des gens. Ce qui est intéressant aussi, c'est de voir la relation entre cette capacité de mobilisation à la base contre l'intelligence artificielle et l'immense travail des grandes entreprises du numérique pour empêcher la constitution de syndicats et le fait que malgré tout, certains y arrivent, comme à l'intérieur de Amazon. C'est difficile, mais ils le font. Et la construction de syndicats me semble, parmi les travailleurs les plus isolés, qui sont ceux de la technologie, quelque chose de très important pour l'avenir.
So I second Hervé's views. The thing I want to say is that what we need to do is recognize that digital technologies are not special. They are not what they told us they were in the 1960s. They are not miraculous, though they sometimes seem they are. They are not outside the laws of physics. They are not outside the laws of commerce. They are not beyond the laws of democracy. When extractivism takes hold, you can push back, as workers have done in Silicon Valley, and try to resist it. You can try to prevent it. There are things you can do now, as we did in the 19th century and the early 20th century. The labor fights underway at the moment are not so very different than previous labor fights. The first thing we have to do is recognize that our situation is not, in fact, unique. It's quite similar to earlier historical situations, and from that place we can take action. Hervé, I do want to dispute one point. This is just to be provocative, because I know we'll talk more. I'm not yet persuaded that AI is going to eliminate jobs. I am persuaded that it's going to move jobs all around. But that's an important distinction. One of the things I've studied is the automation debates of the early 1960s. And many of the fears that we associate with artificial intelligence today were also named during the fear of automation in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. Most of them didn't come true then, and I'm not persuaded they will come true now. That's just for us to argue about later.
Ouais, malgré tout, ma crainte, c'est qu'avec malgré tout, ma crainte est qu'avec l'intelligence artificielle, on arrive à plus d'oppression, plus de demandes d'efficacité au travail, de productivité, là où, notamment avec l'industrialisation, on a eu une période où on pouvait se poser la question de « et si on travaillait moins ?» Et on n'a pas eu cette opportunité, ce débat publiquement, en fait.
Ah, great. So the monitoring of work and the AI competitor is fascinating to me. I wrote an article that you can find in the New York Times Magazine on the history of labor and technology. And one of the things that surprised me was that in 19th century factories, factory owners prevented workers from bringing watches into the factory because they wanted to control time. And when workers brought watches in and began to be able to monitor their own work, it gave them the power to resist. So, yes, being compared to a chatbot is pretty terrible. And there are jobs that a chatbot can do better and cheaper, mostly cheaper, and that will hurt and that will result in job losses. But I also believe that if we shift the terrain of the discussion from efficiency for our bosses and from the integration of technology back to how do we use the technologies that are watches in our time in order to monitor our own behavior and make a case for the best way to do our work and lead a good life, that's how we do it. That's how they did it in the 19th century, and it works. I'm scared, but I'm not terrified. I'm really not. The history says we can do this. I think we're all in a first shock, but we really can do it. I see some skepticism in the front row. I'm a hopeful guy. I'm told that I'm kind of American. I'm kind of always hopeful, except by my students who think I'm terribly depressing. So.
C'est la dernière question.
Bonjour à tous. Merci beaucoup dans un premier temps de votre excellente intervention. Je voulais seulement savoir comment les candidats américains ont utilisé la technologie, l'Internet pour les élections présidentielles. Et est-ce que vous pensez que ça a eu un réel impact dans les résultats ou pas?
Thank you. Yes, I think technology had a tremendous impact on the outcome of the elections, and it's going to continue to until the Democrats learn how to use it again. So there's a wonderful pair of books by a scholar named Daniel Kreiss in the United States, Kreiss, tracking the use of technology in first Democratic and then Republican campaigns in the George Bush era. In his books, databases are the key to success. If you track your population very, very carefully, you can speak to them individually and gain power. And the Democrats did that very well at first, then the Republicans learned how to do it. Okay. Today, it's a different situation. I would argue that the criteria for legitimacy in American society has shifted among politicians from being a reasonable, rational actor supporting certain policies to being an authentic individual. Donald Trump's politics are abhorrent, but his authenticity is undeniable. He gets up on the stage and he says, I'm me, like it or leave it. I do all these horrible things, but I'm me. And people take that seriously. And he uses social media to make that point over and over again. So as the Democrats, who I admire and identify with, are making rational policy proposals, Trump is making AI videos in which he flies an airplane wearing a crown, pooping on American citizens. It's unbelievable. I tried, just as a thought experiment, I tried to imagine Macron in that airplane. It didn't work. So why doesn't that prohibit everybody from believing in Trump? Why doesn't everybody just say the man is a fool and a dangerous fool? Get rid of him. I would argue it's because the logic of legitimacy has changed and personal authenticity, for which the left called for many years, has become the marker. And in that context, social media amplify, accelerate, demand the production of constant authenticity. Of course, constant attention management as well. So if you put the performance of authenticity together with the management of attention and the use of social media, you have a very powerful brew, and the Republicans have done that beautifully. They did that beautifully throughout, on the run-up to the second election, perhaps with help from Russia, I don't know. The Democrats did it very badly. Kamala Harris has no social media game. Smart, fascinating candidate, no social media game. Gavin Newsom, our governor in California has been trolling Donald Trump online. He seems to have a little bit of a new media game. If the Democrats are going to gain any kind of power, they're going to have to speak that language of authenticity, and they're going to have to not be afraid to get dirty in social media.
Merci. Merci Fred pour cette intervention.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So glad to be here.
Ce qu'il vient,
Thank you.
ce qu'il vient de dire est un des éléments de ce petit livre. Et Fred, dans sa gentillesse, veut maintenant dédicacer auprès de notre stand. Je crois que sinon, pour résumer très bien son exposé, c'est pas seulement un cadeau en t-shirt, c'est un cadeau en parole qu'il vient de nous donner.
Ah, resist. Resist. Thank you. Thank you. Please do.